The debate inside the Bolsheviks, discussed in the previous two videos, was taking place against a background of growing dissatisfaction with the government. April the 18th, although May the 1st in the Western calendar, was met with large May Day demonstrations and strikes in every city in Russia. Once again, all the various strata of the population marched together. The ordinary people and the property owners, but it was the working class that dominated. Soldiers also marched alongside German prisoners of war, giving hope for the future. Nevertheless, underneath that triumphal discipline, the underlying mood was tense. Trotsky explains it was becoming harder and harder to live. Prices had risen alarmingly. The workers were demanding a minimum wage. The bosses were resisting. The number of conflicts in the factory was continually growing. The food situation was getting worse. Bread rations were being cut down. Cereal cards had been introduced. Dissatisfaction in the garrison had grown. The district staff, making ready to bridle the soldiers, was removing the more revolutionary units from Petrograd. But the roots of all evils, the war, of which no end was to be seen. When will the revolution bring peace? They asked. The Bolsheviks were being listened to more attentively, if still with hostility from some. Indeed, the Bolshevik banners stood out more strongly on the May Day demonstration than they had on the funeral procession just 25 days before. The Mariinsky Palace, home of the provisional government, was adorned with large red streamers, saying, "Long live the Third International." However, not even the bold Bolsheviks who had put up that streamer could have imagined that the appearance of national unity was about to be split open by, as was bound to happen eventually, the problem of the war. And it was no other than Miliukov who lit the fuse. Encouraged by the entry of America into the war on March the 23rd, Miliukov had spoken out on his aim to seize Armenia, Constantinople, Persia, and so on. This frank description by the supposedly revolutionary Minister of Foreign Affairs of his predatory foreign policy caused alarm in the Soviets. So on March the 27th, the government had agreed to produce a declaration saying that the goal of free Russia is not domination over other peoples, nor depriving them of their national heritage, nor violent seizure of alien territory. Now, this sop to the compromisers was rendered totally meaningless by the addition of the phrase, "Nevertheless, complete observance of the obligations undertaken to our allies." In other words, as Trotsky puts it, we promise not to rob anybody whom we don't need to. However, even this empty declaration still worried the Allies, who sent alarm messages to Petrograd, along with the French supposedly socialist traitor Albert Thomas, who was given the job of convincing the Soviet leadership of the need for imperialist war. This panic was, of course, exactly what Miliukov had hoped for. His fundamental idea was to use the war against the revolution, and the first task upon this road was to demoralize the democracy, Trotsky explains. He wanted to expose the compromisers and force them into a situation where they had to make a clear choice between Bolshevism and imperialism. And so now Miliukov prepared another bombshell. The Soviet EC had been promised that Miliukov would send a note to the Allies confirming the March the 27th declaration. In fact, the note he sent on April the 18th, composed with the help of Thomas and the Allied diplomats, disavowed that declaration. It explained instead that nobody should have the slightest reason to think that the revolution which had occurred entailed a weakening of the role of Russia in the common struggle of the Allies. Quite the contrary, the universal desire to carry the world war through to a decisive victory had only been strengthened. It continued to note that the victors will find means to attain those guarantees and sanctions which are necessary for the prevention of bloody conflicts in the future. As Trotsky says, guarantees and sanctions was of course diplomatic language for annexations and indemnities of taking new territory. Miliukov had ignored the Contact Commission and had sent the note to the Soviet EC only at the same time as he had sent it to the newspapers, thus giving the EC no time to think up excuses before the masses got to hear the news. As Miliukov had hoped, the compromisers squirmed, trying to find a way to save face, particularly as the whole government, including Kerensky, had taken responsibility for the note. Tsereteli and Skobalov tried desperately to find good points in the note, but to no avail. However, as the Soviet EC stalled, another force decided its voice should be heard: the masses. On the afternoon of April 20th, the soldiers took to the streets, 25 to 30,000 of them in all armed, their bayonets holding streamers demanding the resignation of Miliukov and Guchkov. The commotion soon spread to the workers' districts, and whole factories joined the soldiers in the streets. The sharp outbreak of the demonstration reflected the sudden realization by the masses that the government could have been deceiving them all along. Up to now, they'd given it the benefit of the doubt, especially as it included Kerensky after all. Only the Bolsheviks had been saying the government wanted the war prolonged for the sake of capitalist robbery. But their leader, after all, came straight to Petrograd from Berlin. But could it be that Lenin was right and Kerensky wrong after all? Meanwhile, Trotsky adds, the progressive factories and regiments were more and more firmly adopting the Bolshevik slogans of a peace policy, publication of the secret treaties, break with the plans of conquest of the Entente, open proposal of immediate peace to all warring countries. Lenin's approach to Miliukov's support for the Allies could already be seen in a pamphlet produced in early April, describing the attitude of the different parties to the Tsar's war treaties. The cadets, Lenin said, must not allow these treaties to be published, since Russian capital cannot afford to reveal its shady affairs to the public. It said the compromisers are against the treaties, but hope it may be possible to influence the capitalist government. But the Bolsheviks, on the other hand, understand that the whole point is to enlighten the masses as to the utter hopelessness of expecting anything in this respect from capitalist governments, and as to the necessity of the power being transferred to the proletariat and the poor peasants. And now, on April the 20th, Lenin wrote for Pravda that the present Soviet is faced with the alternative: either to swallow the pill offered by Guchkov and Miliukov, or to reject Miliukov's note, which would mean breaking with the old policy of confidence and adopting the course proposed by Pravda. Workers and soldiers, you must now loudly declare that there must only be one power in the country: the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. However, some of the Petrograd Bolsheviks mistook the anger of the masses, who honestly believed in defensism, as a sign of a far more revolutionary understanding, and added the adventurous slogan, "Down with the provisional government." Now, the presence of this slogan had led to a strain of armed insurrection amongst the more left-wing demonstrators, and attempts were made to enter the Mariinsky Palace to arrest the government ministers. Now, the majority of the demonstrators simply wanted to send a warning to the government and to strengthen the position of Kerensky against Miliukov. But the bourgeoisie tried to take advantage of the situation by escalating events into armed clashes, saying that they were protecting the government against attempts to start a civil war. On April the 21st, thousands of workers gathered in the workers' districts, then marched along Petrograd's main avenue, the Nevsky Prospect, on a demonstration called by the Petrograd Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, the cadets had been issuing a special leaflet calling their counter-revolutionary supporters onto the streets, and they marched onto the Nevsky with placards proclaiming full confidence in the provisional government and long live Miliukov. Clashes became more and more fierce. By the afternoon, the shooting had become almost continuous. Trotsky's history says, "No, that day was not in the least like a manifestation of national unity. Two worlds stood face to face, two human floods, one for Constantinople, one for peace, had issued from different parts of the town. Different in social composition, not a bit similar in external appearance, and with hostile inscriptions on their placards. As they clashed together, they brought into play fists, clubs, and even firearms." Finally, the news spread that General Kornilov, no doubt under instructions from the cadets, was moving cannon onto the square in front of the Mariinsky Palace, ready to fire on the demonstrators. Now, the evening before, on the 20th, Miliukov's plan to scare the Soviet leadership into supporting the bourgeoisie had seemed to be working. At a joint meeting of the EC and the government, Prince Lvov had threatened to resign in the face of the agitation against the note. The horrified compromisers, of course, drew back, readily accepted a worthless explanation of Miliukov's note, and on the 21st had spent their time trying to persuade the demonstrators to disperse. However, with Kornilov's guns ready, even the EC could see that their own heads might now be crushed, not just the workers and soldiers. So the EC ordered the soldiers in Kornilov's hands to return to barracks, and the crisis was diffused. However, as an illustration of the changing balance of forces, this event set a precedent which meant that from now on, every order for the dispatch of troops had to have official Soviet sanction. Now, the April crisis seemed to have passed without any lasting effects. The Soviet EC hastily met on the evening of the 21st and, having successfully held back the masses, voted by 34-19 to declare the matter of the note closed. The Bolshevik, Fyodorov, had gained a good deal of support when he had called for the Soviets to seize the power at a plenary session of the Soviet the evening before. Now the EC's position was carried at the Petrograd Soviet by a huge majority. The intermediate soldier mass had for a brief period swung towards the proletariat, causing the crisis, but had now swung back towards the Soviet leadership and hence, in effect, the bourgeoisie. However, as Lenin pointed out to the party, this vacillation of the petty bourgeois layers was the music of the future. Under the pressure of events, they would continue to swing between bourgeoisie and proletariat, causing more crises. The job of the Bolsheviks was to carry on their agitation, particularly amongst the most backward layers that had supported the bourgeoisie in the April days, until the intermediate strata swung decisively to the side of the workers. Even at an early stage, the experience of the April days nevertheless had lasting effects on the consciousness of the masses, accelerating the pace of events. Meetings and protests opposing the policy of Miliukov had taken place all over Russia. Just as in February itself, and in the March struggle for the 8-hour day, the April demonstration was a warning to the leadership. Action taken by direct intervention of the masses, without the permission of the Soviet parties. And the Bolshevik Party had come out of the April crisis strengthened by events, despite the adventurous policy of some of the Petrograd Committee. The party had been unprepared for the crisis, still finishing its own internal debate, and the call for the demonstration on the 21st had not had sufficiently clear aims. And afterwards Lenin criticised the Petrograd leadership, saying, "You can overthrow one who is known to the people as a tyrant, But there are no tyrants now. The cannon and the rifles are in the hands of the soldiers, not the capitalists. The capitalists are not prevailing with violence, but deceit. And you can't talk about violence, it's mere nonsense. We gave the slogan of a peaceful demonstration. We wanted only to make a peaceful reconnoitre of the enemy's strength, not give battle. But the Petrograd Committee aimed a wee bit too far to the left. Along with the correct slogan, "Long live the Soviets," they gave a wrong one, "Down with the provisional government." A moment of action is no time to aim a wee bit too far to the left. We look upon that as the greatest crime, disorganisation. And of course, Lenin was no pacifist. With a different correlation of forces in Petrograd, the committee would have been entirely correct. But for now, the task was still to patiently explain. As the Bolshevik CC resolution on April the 22nd said, "We shall favour the transfer of power to the proletarians and semi-proletarians only when the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies adopt our policy and are willing to take power into their hands." Now, the party organisation had clearly not been strong enough in the April days, but it did lead to vital recruitment into the party, workers transferring their names from Mensheviks to Bolsheviks. The district Soviets, being closer to the factories, first showed this sharp turn to the left, with the Bolsheviks finding themselves as a majority in a number of Soviets in Vyborg and elsewhere. By the beginning of May, Sukhanov estimated that a third of the Petrograd proletariat was supporting the Bolsheviks, and that, of course, the most active third. As Trotsky concludes, the March formlessness had disappeared. Political lines were sharpening. The supposedly fantastic theses of Lenin were taking flesh in the Petrograd workers' districts.